This is for you now.
People have already talked about this stuff. Does this even matter? Things are terrible.
Let them watch. I don't care. We got to
Right.
do this.
Don't tell me we can't do this.
We're doing it.
100%. I know a lot of things. We're past most of what I know. We can't have a conversation.
Some steamy stuff in there. Hello and welcome to Road Goes Ever On and On. Today I am back joining Sterling to talk about the 6th episode of Three Body Problem. So spoilers ahead. If you like the content that you see, please hit that like and subscribe button and turn on that bell for notifications so that we can stay up to date in your feed. And with that, Sterling, how you been? It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. It's nice to have you back. Let's jump in with actually the beginning of the episode. It feels like a big pivot, and so like setting the scene from this point on.
Yeah, I actually watching the last episode, episode 5, I did feel like that could have just been the end of this series. Like I thought it like was just huge cliffhanger, they're coming to get us, and it is really cool to see like how the rest of the world are dealing with these aliens that are coming to, mess up Earth.
And it does feel like a pretty big change of pace, Like there's the previous episodes it's figuring out what's going on and that first big action we're going to take against them, and now everybody knows, and that feels like that changes how the world will be going forward,
Yeah.
and feels like it's changing the pace of the show as well. It's no longer a question of what's going on, it's now a question of how are we going to deal with this.
Right, we see there's people that are celebrating it, like almost like the followers of the Santi that are trying to, basically say like these are our Lord and Saviors. They're, almost like religious fanatics in a way. There are people that are afraid and rioting, and like seems like maybe the structures of society are crumbling a little bit.
Right. I feel like something like this is showing how it's bringing out the best and worst in humanity at the same time. There are people who are doubling down on themselves, the rioters you talked about, and then there's other people who are focused on the future and saving mankind rather than worrying about themselves. And so it's kind of interesting that something like this can amplify both sides.
Yeah, and I think they do a really good job, not just in the beginning. Well, the beginning scene, it shows like everybody, like how the world's facing it. We see a quick shot of President Biden, you
I
know,
thought that was funny.
including it into today's day and age. So either, this happens in the next year or maybe in the next 4 years. We'll see if it's a true to reality. But
Right.
the grocery store scene when they're trying to pick up goods, and like how this is like affected like global supply chains in trying to stock just grocery stores.
Right. And once again, that kind of goes back to like potentially maybe the worst of humanity, where if everybody gets a normal amount, then there will be things for everybody. But because people are worried about, will there be supplies? So I'm going to buy all the supplies. And that leads to these shortages that like creates this feedback loop, of now people go in and see empty shelves. And now the next time that's stocked, they're going to be the person that buys that because they're like, I'm not going to let that happen to me again.
I mean, I hate to bring up a sore subject, but it is kind of like what happened during COVID with the big TP
It's,
scare of 2020.
yeah.
Some
And
people were
that's
buying toilet paper, and then they were running out, and people were like, "Oh boy, we got to stock up on toilet paper."
it happens and it happens every time. The interesting thing is I get it a little bit with like disasters like hurricanes where, Are roads going to be open? Will something bad have happened to the grocery store? Who knows? In that case, it is kind of a situation of something bad could happen that could prevent you from getting it. Versus COVID, it was just like people were getting ready for the apocalypse, and they were doing this exact same thing, and then that causes that loop. I know people who 100% did that. They're like, it's tough to get this stuff, so I found some over here and I got a whole bunch of it. It's like,
Yeah,
okay,
you
you're
gotta
feeding
stock
into
up.
the problem.
Which, kind of, I think this takes us a little bit to the next topic. Like
Yeah,
almost like COVID in a real world environment. This is like fighting for humanity, right? The fight for
yes,
humanity, and something that this kind of parallels in this day and age is climate change, right? Like, and
yeah,
I know you guys touched on this a little bit in the previous episodes, and it's like the argument that Augie kind of makes in this episode, where she's like, the problem's not going to be here for 400 years. Like,
yeah.
everybody we know is not going to be a part of, the Santi being here and fighting us. It's almost like climate change. Like, oh yeah, like, should we do anything about climate change? It's not really going to affect, us, and maybe not really even our children, maybe our grandchildren. Like, do we need to do anything? And I think that this brings up a good question of like, do you fight for humanity as a whole?
I think the crappy situation in for us is that climate change is something where you have to trust science in order to believe that that is a thing. And so there are a lot of people who just straight up deny that versus I think in this they at least have the benefit of I think most everybody saw what happened in the sky and potentially an eye looking at them and blinking at them and the you are bugs type situation. Which to a certain extent then amplifies what you're pointing out of this isn't going to happen to you, your kids, or their kids. So is it important or like does it matter to you? Because it really amplifies that because now it's not like a do you believe or not.
I do think that it is important, like as a fight for humanity as a whole. Like, if we could do stuff to better humanity moving forward, like the ideas that we want to keep humans going as long as we can, if there are steps that we can take to mitigate our death and destruction, I think it's important.
It also when there is a common world enemy, not just country enemy, but world enemy, and a big problem like this, it shows you what can be accomplished. Right now, I think NASA receives less than half a penny of every tax dollar, and it's severely like cut at the knees. And so there's a huge limit to what it can do. But they're talking about putting bases on the moon and building ships on those bases on the moon. And it's wild what at this point, who's going to say no to spending on like a NASA defense budget? So it's crazy what can be accomplished when there's an enemy like that you're going against. Or like a kind of a similar parallel. Don and I are watching For All Mankind, and it starts around the time of like the space race, but with it diverges from our history very quickly. But we saw that same kind of thing with the space race where the worry of the Russians getting to the moon first spurred us towards that, and that who knows when that would have happened if we didn't have that bug up our butt. And this is kind of showing that same kind of thing where it's like at this point no is not an option. I think like Thomas Wade is like we're this is what I want to do, and I'm not taking the people who are saying like it's not possible. I'm just going to find the person who's going to make it happen.
Yeah. And I do think that there is that little bit of nice like comfort for Thomas Wade being like, okay, look, we know that the technology can be made. Like, they have it, they're coming towards us, and we need to get this done. So we know it can happen. So I don't want to hear no or like anybody putting up like, oh, what if this, what if that? Like, we're getting it done.
Right.
We're going to go meet the Santi where they are.
It's wild, and it's really cool seeing what people can do when they can kind of come together like this, you know? It's crazy that they, in that opening scene, you also saw as riots were happening, militaries had to be brought in order to deal with that. So I don't know if some places have gotten to like martial law.
It would be really cool to see the geopolitical dynamics of like having this outer threat, like yeah, there's some riots from, the everyday man that's just scared of what is the potential of aliens coming to Earth. But I think it would be cool to see like does this unite Earth? Like does this make,
Right.
instead of us being countries and having individual resources, do we like start pooling all the resources together?
It's interesting. There's a common thing that happens to people that go into space is that most people that go into space have this huge kind of epiphany and takeaway where, so for one, from space, you don't see borders. There aren't countries. There are just land masses and water. So there's nothing other than like oceans, there's nothing that divides us. But then more importantly than that, the Earth from space, it's a marble and everything else around you is space. And that's a close perspective. That's from like, orbit or from like the moon. If you go farther than that, Earth is nothing. It's a speck. It's smaller than a speck depending on how far you go away. And seeing like how thin the atmosphere is that actually keeps us alive, it gives them this idea of the fragility of humankind and really imparts this like need to work together to keep us all alive. So we're on this like minuscule thing with like this barely perceptible, atmosphere keeping us alive with no line separating us, and everything that we should be doing should be to protect this like very fragile situation we have in this huge universe. And I think to a certain extent, people are seeing something very similar to that in realizing that we can be extinguished by another, you know, by an outside force. Is like all of a sudden life on this planet is fragile and maybe we need to come together.
And you can see that they can screw up our situation right off the back with these, these protons, these supercomputer protons that can
Right.
just change like end signs for us and like really, set us back in our, you know innovation.
Absolutely. So I think that kind of gets us to one of the ways that we are fighting for humanity, which is the staircase. And I thought this was interesting because we see one of the things we already touched on, which is like there are so many people that have the wrong mindset in this kind of situation. They're stuck with what they know and they're just dealing with the no's. Like we can't do that because of this. We can't do that because of it. It's like the people who give excuses, like rather than finding solutions. And it was interesting seeing Thomas Wade very quickly be sick of these people and being, wanting to find the person who isn't explaining why we can't do things and instead looking for the person who's like, don't tell me we can't do this.
We're doing it.
Tell me how we can do this.
Yeah. I liked how he was talking to Jin about that in the like when he was first like getting her to be like, okay, like how do we get this going? And her devising the pre-plan of keeping the photons busy by like just having regular intervals, like keep one of them busy.
Right.
That like cuts the Santi, like what they're trying to do, like their power in half.
Yeah. And then if there's somebody that they need to watch constantly, that could tie up the other one. Like that's very interesting how quickly she came up with that. because that's one of the excuses that somebody came up with. Like, does this even matter if they can just see everything that we say and do? Does it matter if we come up with a plan?
And Thomas's
Um,
retort to that was like, "Let them watch. I don't care. We got to
right.
do this. Like, we're gonna keep trying to advance our technology, and hopefully they don't screw with us too much. But we're gonna keep going. We can't stop."
What did you think of the actual solution that Jin came up with? This staircase of, all of these rungs in the ladder where they're going to be nuclear explosions propelling a ship with a sail that can like ride the blasts from these.
I think that she's watched a little bit too many Vin Diesel movies. I think that no, I do think that it's a very like I had no idea how you're going to be able to travel 1% of light speed. Like that seems so out of grasp of like what we know today that nothing would have made sense, but the fact that like they had a pretty seems like a reasonable idea. Like I know it is going to be expensive and hopefully the world can, you know, like we were saying before, maybe grow together and pool their resources together to get these nukes up in space. I think it's could work. I want to know what you think about putting a person in there.
That's so. I mean, I think that is completely doable. And this book is science fiction, but it's like capital science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Like some books talk about like the hypothetical ideas of science. Maybe we could build this at some point, or like come up with an interesting idea like time travel. If we could do that, what would be the ramifications of that? This is built very much based off of our current scientific understanding. Now, some of the stuff is very theoretical science, so we haven't necessarily like actually tested this to know it, but we've put a lot of thought into it. And interestingly enough, I don't know how many years ago I saw a video on kind of this topic. Shout out to PBS Spacetime. We'll put a card in one of these sides to the linking to the video because it's great, talking about a situation very similar to this. It's like, what if we needed to get to Alpha Centauri because something bad was going to happen to us? And the first thing it brought up is the biggest thing that people talk about with this is the weight calculation. So it's like the idea of you want to get there as quickly as possible, but also if you wait long enough and work on new technology, that new technology will likely be faster and you could potentially overtake that. But there's a very simple scale in that of like there is a sweet spot where if you wait too long, just building something sooner will get there faster than, So that's the first thing, but then it talked about like five ideas of getting there. The first being rocket fuel. It's a non-starter. We would need a fuel tank the size of the observable universe in order to propel us at 1% the speed of light. So that's just off
Out.
the table. It talked about building a ship and exploding hydrogen bombs. I think these hydrogen bombs were actually on the ship. I don't think it was this staircase where the bombs are placed and then that propels something with like a sail that can ride the radiation from that. And it talked about the problem that came up in this, which is like you can get there in like 44 years exploding that, but you got to stop, which means that you would have to carry enough explosives to explode in front of you to slow you down. And that slows you down dramatically because of like the weight of that. And so we're closer to like 90 years doing something like that if you actually want to be able to stop at Alpha Centauri. Then it talked about antimatter, which is wild, like collision of, matter and antimatter. It's very tough to make. It's would need to be made in like, in like the super colliders. It did talk about a sail, but in this case a light sail instead of radiation. And you would likely have like the size and energy required. You'd probably have to build that in orbit of the sun or on the moon like the laser that would actually propel that light sail. But that's one of the fastest ones. Still has a slowing down issue, so you'd still have to like have a similar solution for slowing down. And then the last one being like a black hole drive, which is what. So it's like people have already talked about this stuff, and this is a very real idea with very real science behind it. It's just very theoretical.
Right.
And in all of these situations, it is talking about getting people to Alpha Centauri because the Earth, something cataclysmic is going to happen to it.
Right. So that I was a little perplexed when Thomas Wade offered to put a person into the, the spaceship or probe, whatever they're sending out, and how going that fast would affect
Yeah.
the body and how they would have to mitigate that, and how he's so confident that the Santee would grab them out of the sky, like grab the probe to stop them.
So it's not going that fast isn't the problem. It's acceleration is always the issue. Speed, fixed speed, with what Einstein came up with like relativity doesn't mean anything. If you are in an enclosed space and you can't see anything around you and you're going a fixed speed, like when you're in an elevator and it's not stopping or accelerating, you literally can't tell that you're going up or going down. If you're in a car and you put on like a VR headset and it's not accelerating and there's no bumps, you literally can't, like when you're in a plane, shut the window on a plane, you can't tell that you're going crazy speeds. And according to relativity, there is nothing to say that you aren't actually fixed and it's the Earth that is moving. That those perspectives are equally accurate. So it's not the speed, it's the acceleration. So I don't know how that works out with exploding nukes behind you. Like what level of G-force human body can withstand. But that's what they need to worry about is if they speed up too quickly, yeah, we'd slam against the ship and we would just be smashed by this ship smashing into us at crazy speeds.
Just like a little bug smashing on the windshield.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like, you
You're just
know,
like, gotta get these little humans. I knew they were bugs.
so that's the real issue. It's not the speed. It's the
Acceleration.
acceleration, and I assume they would account for that. Second part, as far as why he's so confident, I think he knows more, and I think we're gonna get to that. But I think it's one of those things where it's like it's a and not that I know anything in this case because we're past where I am and book one is done.
Did
We're
book
into book two.
did book one end at the eye in the sky?
I don't remember exactly what it ended with. It did have the ship, but the ship scene was very different because we kind of knew it was coming and they explained a lot of it beforehand. I like how they did it, not necessarily better. I think for a show, this was the better option of like not give the information away and allow it to have that visual impact because I don't think you can have that like visceral gut impact that a show can where it's like one image can be so much more powerful than 1,000 words. So I think for this medium, they did the right thing of like doing that. They did talk about the Sophons. I don't remember if the Sophon. I don't think it cut. There was a thing about you are bugs, so I think we did get to that point. I think that was basically the end of the first book. I don't think it was quite as dramatic a scene as what we saw in the show, and there was a little bit more information about like how they built the Sophons and something because the book spends more time on the science.
Yeah, that's
The
what you said.
show spends more time on like the effect of it and the characters. So we're past most of what I know. There might be a few sprinklings in that still pop up, but for the most part, we're past what I know.
Well, I think that is a great transition to talking about the characters.
Wild. This show was so different from this episode was so different from the episodes that have come before it. I feel like every episode has had a big set piece. And this one, you could potentially argue that like the opening scene with like the riots around the world is the big set piece, but it's also done in like it's being watched on TV, so it's like the grainy footage. It's making it clear that these are like news reports. And so I'm sure it did still cost a good amount of money, but it wasn't anything crazy like we've seen previously. And once we're done with that opening scene, it's mostly character stuff.
Yeah.
Characters struggling with things, characters dealing with each other, like very different and very interesting, I thought.
I have a PSA.
Okay.
This is for you now. This is maybe not for him, but this is for you. Don't give somebody a goldfish, especially in that kind of setup with no heater, no filter. Pet goldfish don't make good gifts. I'm just going to say that. Don't do that. Don't give it to people. Then, especially people that are going to die, because then who's going to take care of that fish afterwards? Here's the PSA. Don't give people fish unless they want fish. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Do you have a recommendation of what they should give? Like what should it just not
Flowers?
be a
Flowers are
non
nice.
flowers?
A plant?
Flowers.
Plant is great. Give somebody a plant it for them. I'm all about that. Don't give them fish. Fish are hard to care for. That setup is not a great setup for fish, unfortunately. And goldfish, that fish is too big for that bowl. And it's, going to grow bigger and need like a pond. So I'm just going to get off my little soapbox now. But I don't like when shows show people giving fish. It's not good because then people want to give people fish.
It gives the idea to everybody else that like that's a good idea, and it doesn't talk about any of the ramifications. It makes sense.
That's my only PSA about that. But love the episode, love the characters. I feel like Dawn would have loved to talk about the character relationships that we saw in this episode.
I definitely think the science was very minimal in this. The characters were very maximal, and so I'm sure she would have loved to have dug into all of that. It was wild. Like I think Yi Wenji, seeing how when she finally gets out, her first view of what she potentially brought to us is like people basically begging for money. I know it's donations, but it's like people begging for money for the sake of humanity. Like that's crazy for her to have been living this life beforehand, being taken in, and then being released to this world and seeing that.
Yeah, and Jin brought up a good point when they first, they finally get to see each other after everything that happened, and was just like, you didn't really see the turmoil that was caused from your actions. Like, you've been isolated. Like, you didn't see the eye, you didn't see the riots, you haven't seen what the world has become, and now she's, finally get that perspective.
And that was an interesting, moment between those characters of seeing Jin struggling with finally understanding that this person that she looked on as like a de facto family member, like not related by blood, but basically has kind of taken care of her at times. And so she kind of considers her a family member, is actually the cause of the death of one of her best friends.
Two of her best friends.
The two of her, yes. And how that's like messed with her brain. So like that was a really interesting thing, and that kind of brought to light people finally talking to Yi Wenji about how she impacted her daughter. So it was interesting that it was like both a conflict between these two people, but then that also started that question of like an internal conflict of what did Yi Wenji do to herself in her own life. She goes home to a home without a daughter where she has to like light an incense candle next to this photo, and that's the consequences of her actions.
Do we think there will be more? They keep asking about Vera and like why she ended up, killing herself. Do you think there will be more to it and like an actual like this is why she did it, and not just she read the emails and said nothing and then just decided to
My thought, that's it for the Vera storyline, but I think Yi still has, or Wenji still has more story to tell.
She definitely said she has a couple of ideas up her sleeve ready to
Yes,
maybe make it a fair fight or no fight at all. So
right.
I don't
So
know.
I think that's a pretty good tell that she's got something up her sleeve and she's not out of this.
I did like that scene though because they've been on a parallel of like religious zealots the whole time. That was her like talking to the protons to be like, hey, I know you're not communicating with me anymore, and it
Yeah,
almost looked like she was praying to an invisible
she was
force.
kneeling.
Yeah,
She had just lit incense. Like maybe that's in honor of her child. Maybe that's like to kind of start this conversation. Who knows? It did kind of look religious.
did look a little bit religious. Now, going back to the Oxford 5 real quick.
Yes.
One problem I have is I feel like Saul doesn't have enough to do. Like he's not like he's kind of helping, like he talks to people and he, is helped Augie, when she was like throwing up, but like
Hmm.
each one of the five has had like a direct connection and like a story to do. So like Will maybe hasn't had a huge connection, but he has cancer that has been dominating like the Oxford 5 and losing a friend. And Saul, I just feel like he's just kind of there.
I Vera said if anybody can solve this, you can to Saul before she took her life.
But that was
So,
for the proton colliders, and wasn't the one that solved it. We now know it was the
but
Santi.
that's her way of saying you are really smart, and we've had more clues of this where when Augie brought Saul along to see whatever she was told she was going to see at midnight, she wanted a very scientific mind next to her to be like the a second set of eyes, but a scientific set of eyes. And he made a comment. I don't remember if it was like cipher or Morse code, and she was like, "You know that?" And he's like, "I know a lot of things." So they keep dropping these hints that there's a lot there, but I think he's potentially one. I don't think he thinks highly of himself. He
Mm-hmm.
said early on that everybody that according to Einstein, if you're past this age and you haven't had a scientific breakthrough, you're done. So I think he's given up on himself. And
Okay.
I think he's a really smart slacker, because he doesn't believe in himself that he has anything to give. I think he just kind of goes through the motions.
Okay.
It's funny, I was going to ask you this question. I was going to say, Saul hasn't done much. What do you think Saul is going to do? Versus you're like, why is Saul here?
Yeah. Why is he even here? He's just
I think he has more to bring. I don't know what it is because I haven't read the second book, but I think he has something very specific he is going to bring.
okay. That's fair. And we still, have two more episodes. He could very well do something in these two episodes, like so that his character's not completely a nothing burger for a whole
Yeah.
season. So there are two episodes left. He could definitely, pull it together. He was an advocate of Will telling Jin how he really feels about her,
Yeah.
which
To
also
that end, he seems like he's filling a very like in the meantime he feels like he's filling in a very good role of both Will's friend but also the person who's pushing Will in the last hours of his life to it doesn't matter at this point, like what are the
yeah,
consequences to you? Just do everything you want to do at this point.
right.
And I think that's the distraction from the fact that I think he definitely has a bigger part in this.
I don't know if I understood Jin's metaphor to Will. She makes the paper boats.
Hmm.
They're sitting right next to each other. She's mad that he didn't tell her. She makes the paper boats and she puts them. She's like, "This one's me. This one's you." And like to me, I was like, okay, so within 5 seconds, we're just gonna drift apart, and also paper in the water, we're just gonna sink. So I had a hard time understanding her metaphor there.
I didn't necessarily get that. She's also like a theoretical scientist that doesn't know how to communicate with people well.
Oh, right, true.
We saw that with like Raj's family. And I actually thought it was kind of appropriate that she folds paper, origami in order to create a boat, which is kind of how the whole thing with like extra dimensions is that the reason we can't see the extra dimensions is because they are folded up so small that we can't see them on a large scale. Otherwise, yeah, I have no clue what she was saying. I think
I took the metaphor as we're two ships passing in the night. You're going your way, I'm going my way. See you later, Will. Good luck in the afterlife.
I think she was trying to be nice.
No,
I
I
don't know
know.
I don't know what the point of it was, and I also don't know when he saw those, was that hallucination or like his was it his cancer, making him see things? Was it one of the sophons making him see things? Like I don't know exactly what that scene was.
Yeah, I didn't quite get that either. Like they were a lot bigger. I couldn't imagine the Sophons would try to encourage him to give all his money to Jin to help fight the Santi. So I don't know. I thought the whole little boat metaphor was a little weird.
Yeah, it didn't hold water,
Some would
which is
say
not what boats do. The boats don't. Anyways,
paper boats do.
I'll work.
They
I'll work on a
yes.
better mode of metaphor.
But talking about Jin and Raj now, we
Yes.
they now have
I
a
think Don might be onto something with was Raj selected possibly because of a connection with Jin.
I do believe that she's correct in that. I think that Thomas Wade could use like he seems like a smart guy, and he I mean he kind of messed around with Raj in this episode, but I think that he acquired Raj to be this head of this operation because he could use Raj to maybe manipulate Jin.
I potentially think so because it's interesting. He'd pushed Raj earlier when he first met Raj, and was asking Raj for information that Raj shouldn't be giving up to anybody. And then finally saying, you could ask for my ID, but then I'd know that you're just like every other whatever. And then Raj responds with, let me see your ID. And then this whole thing felt like another one of those kind of like pushing tests of you have 3 minutes and let me waste some of it with this question of like it's stuffy in here. And Raj seems like he may be extremely smart, because he did say that I don't remember what he said he had knowledge of.
He's a
Maybe
nuclear physicist, right, or something?
new or like worked with nuclear ships or yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
like had right. So he's obviously very smart, but he also seems very inside the box. So he may be smart, he may be a soldier, but he seems very inside the box versus Jin, who, when everybody else is saying we can't do this because of this, this, and this, Jin is the one who comes out of the box and is like, I know this is going to sound very crazy, and there's a lot we're going to have to get around. Like, it's illegal with the treaties we have, but what about this?
Yeah. It's going to cost
Um,
$1 trillion.
right,
But
right.
that's not my problem.
That's and that's what he was asking for. Is like, don't give me the reasons we can't do it. Just give me the solution, and
Mhm.
then they can figure out what the problems are and try and work around that. So it's like, okay, yeah, this goes against a bunch of treaties.
We can
Treaties
ratify.
can be changed.
Yeah.
Like
What
maybe
do
this
you
costs a lot of money, but maybe a bunch of governments can get together and like.
when Jin found out about what Raj did with the Day of Judgment, they kind of had a back and forth of like, yeah, you can do your science and you're behind a computer desk the whole time. You don't have to deal with the repercussions of war. And
Right.
Raj feels that he has to do the hard things and make the hard decisions so that Jin can have a safe, peaceful life. Like, I don't know who's in the right here.
It's unfortunate because I do feel like both roles are necessary, and one of them, like the scientists, they get to talk about the theoreticals of this idea and this one application, even though, as Augie points out, you can build something that has one application that's good for the world and it can be taken as a weapon. So they do these very theoretical things from these very high perches, and then there's the people in the trenches that keep us safe in, unfortunately, at times, all of the worst ways.
I am a little surprised that Augie didn't think that those nano fibers or
Nanofibers, yeah.
would be instantly used as a weapon. And I think that's why the Santi had the countdown for her, was so that this could be developed as a weapon against the Santi.
I don't think it was as a weapon against the Santi. I think it was not as a weapon against their followers. Because once they realized that even Mike, one of their like strongest followers, was like, all humans lie. Once they realized that, and Mike is also a human, then Mike is also an enemy. They weren't worried about the nanofibers. So I don't think they were worried about that being used against them. I think they were worried about that being used against their followers when they cared about their followers. And then they're like, well, screw these people.
Well, yeah, but I did think, how they have that fear that like their technology would exponentially grow to a point. They're like, okay, if you have the ability to give 400 years to these nanofibers, like what kind of weapon could you make with these nanofibers? And now that they've kind of written off humans as a whole, they're like, well, we'll just stop everything on our own with these sophons.
Sophons, yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see.
I'm curious about. So you weren't here for the first 5 episodes. First 5 episodes.
First 5 episodes.
I'm curious what your thoughts were on some of the things that maybe Dawn and I touched on, kind of up to this point.
Yeah, like one thing that I totally agreed with both you and Don on was this like conflicted struggle of if the Santi were good, if you feel sympathetic towards them, if
Yeah.
they have a place on this earth, like it does, especially with that little girl, it paints them in this very empathetic light. Like you want to like you feel bad that they can't like have just like moments of stable existence. And I was struggling until they called us bugs, and then now I'm get out of here, Santi, go find a different planet. I liked all of that. I liked how the video game worked, and like trying to I liked the mysteries that it set up early on.
Yeah.
Like what is this video game? Why are these scientists killing themselves? What are the countdown, like these countdowns that they're seeing? I thought those were all really compelling storytelling tools that kept me very into this show. Like I think that right off the bat, the first episode and up until episode 5 and still, I was pretty hooked with this premise, this idea of what was going on. I really liked it.
So I asked Dawn a question very very early on, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. This is by the same creators of Game of Thrones, like the people bringing it to the TV. Obviously not the author, but the same people who brought us Game of Thrones. And I feel like Netflix was potentially hoping this could be their next Game of Thrones. On that kind of larger viewpoint, what is your thought? Like, do you think that's what Netflix is trying to do? Do you think they're at all close to that arena? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I know it's the same guys, and I know that they kind of fumbled the ball with Game of Thrones. And so like I don't necessarily know if I would put my investment in them making the next Game of Thrones. Like they were supposed to helm the next Star Wars trilogy, and Disney was just like, yeah, now that they kind of dropped the ball, we don't want this. I think that the premise of Three Body Problem could have been Game of Thrones level. Like they could have
I think
had
it
it.
really could have.
But I also think, one thing that we complain about the Netflix model as well is them releasing it all at once.
100%. I was talking to Dawn about this. Okay, so the last episode, Judgment Day, it's about the middle of the season. This should have been, man, the discussions that people could have had for a full week after this.
Yeah.
It's a huge WTF moment. It's like what comes after that. Like you can spend a lot of time just discussing what you saw because it was an amazing scene. I think it was beautifully done. I really do. I think they nailed that scene.
I agree.
You could spend a lot of time just dissecting what they did, and then you can also spend a ton of time hypothesizing what comes after that because it has such a big impact. And how many people would have guessed what came up in this episode we just watched? Like that should have been such a great water cooler moment for a full week. Maybe there would have been memes. Who knows what would have come out of this? But it is so tough to have that conversation when I've got a bunch of stuff going on in my life, so I can't burn through it. So I just got to this after however many days, weeks. Who can I talk to about this? Oh, you're not at that episode yet. You burned through the series. You're so far through it that you don't want to ruin anything that you don't remember if it came up yet, so you don't want to talk too much about things because you don't know what happened in episodes like 6 through 8 or 10, because it blurs together when you just burn through it. So you can't really talk much about it, and one, you can't really talk much about what happened because you don't want to ruin anything, but even that scene has blurred in your mind because it's been so long since you've watched it because you burned through it and it took me a while to get to it that we can't we can't have a conversation.
Yeah, and I do think Game of Thrones, that was such I think this is how memorable it is. I haven't watched Game of Thrones season 1 since it aired, but I remember the 7th episode was the episode that Ned Stark gets killed in. Spoiler alert, sorry, it's been out for a while. I think it's, past the time of reason. But he got, he's killed, and that was such a way far left field moment. You think he's getting sent to the wall. He gets killed instead, and it was crazy. That was such a crazy moment. And I remember talking to people about that, being like, they killed Ned Stark. How is this show going to continue on? He's the main character. And I just don't think it works with the binge model.
I remember the conversations that were held at work after Game of Thrones. Every time I could talk to another person, it would be a Game of Thrones conversation. And then I'd encounter somebody else at work and we'd talk about Game of Thrones. And then at some point, there would be the person lying as they go by that would actually take the time to be like, please don't talk about Game of Thrones around me. I haven't had the time to watch the episode yet. It's the person desperately trying not to have any kind of spoilers because basically most everybody was talking about it at work. That's how big it was. Most everybody was talking about it at work. And it was hard to avoid those conversations. And I just feel what kind of conversations can we have when everybody's on a different pace and when everybody's finally caught up? The person who just finished it and wants to have that conversation, how compelling is it to talk with somebody who's binged 2 other shows since and has forgotten most of the details? It's, yeah, you can talk about the big moments, the biggest, but even that is kind of blurry. It's just...
I've been loving this show, but I have heard no discourse about this show. Nobody's talking about it. And I think that is the problem that Netflix is they're gonna have this they're never gonna have their Game of Thrones with this release schedule.
And I don't think that this show was the next Game of Thrones. I don't think they quite nailed it. I do think it could have been. I do think it's a great show. I don't think they quite nailed it. I thought it was interesting. One of the things that they kind of brought in, which I didn't feel was necessary, which is like trying to get in a little bit of the Game of Thrones TNA. We saw it when like the followers were being, or when the people were being rehydrated.
Mm.
We saw a little bit of like TNA, you know, and this episode, the closest we got to it was like when Augie's trying to drink her issues away, you know, because she realizes the impact of what she did, and she ends up having serious issues in the middle of the night, you know, while she's in her like bra and panties, and Saul has to come in and help her to the toilet as she throws up. And so you get a little bit of, it's not quite TNA, she's covered up, but I don't know if they have this scene in book two, because I don't think that this is book one stuff. But I have a feeling that it's probably not in there. And it just like the people rehydrating and seeing some of their bobs and bits, and like this scene felt a little bit like, let's bring in a little bit of like that stuff that people like from that, and I don't think that's what this is,
Well,
and
yeah,
so I
and
don't think it needs it.
yeah, and HBO or Game of Thrones was no like it was talked about for its, intense gore and violence and its TNA.
Yes.
And I do
Yes.
think that they did try to do maybe things that were like not even just the boat scene, but like, the eyes being pulled out and like how they killed Jack and how
Yeah.
they
The that scene of finding the person that had gouged out their eyes, that's not in the book. That's they talk about scientists taking their lives, but there's no graphic descriptions of it being that awful. So
right,
to me, that was another one of like their set pieces of how can we crank this up to 11 for TV,
right.
you know, and really use like the visual medium, and 100% like that was not, it's a much smaller mystery, which does eventually balloon into this, but like for quite some time there's just like weird stuff happening,
Yeah.
versus like the show right off the bat is like things are terrible.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, I don't think it's going to be the next Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Don was right. Try harder, Netflix. Do better.
I did, you know, I did want to commend them on one thing I really liked this episode, which was, so I don't feel like they've really used outside music up to this point, and this episode ended with, you know, video games from Lana Del Rey, and I felt like that was a beautiful needle drop moment. You know, that doesn't, needle drops can easily be abused by people who don't know how to use them. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it can be a cheap way to like, the audience already knows this, the audience already likes it, so we don't have to spend a ton of time on this composition. The audience already has a feeling from it, so it's like instantly going to like help us achieve a certain whatever. And so I do think it can be a cheap way to try and rope audiences into feeling a certain thing and liking this sound. The people who do it great are great with it. But I like the fact that the show hasn't done it up to this point, and I feel like when they finally introduced that, it was well done. I liked how they slowly brought it in with this part
So
where you couldn't necessarily tell it was a song.
it was almost like an
And
instrumental piano version first when he's seen the boats, and then
yeah,
not until he gets to the stars our destination place that the actual song came over, which was very well done.
finally swelling into it and then taking us out on the credits still with that song and hanging through the credits with it. I did think that was a beautiful bit of composition. I did think that they nailed that sound wise, and not everybody does. So like hats off to them for that.
And I feel like the song was perfect choice. Like it had the meaning of like, I would do anything for Jin because he is in love with Jin, but
Yep.
also what the screens were playing behind him as he's walking by, it's like a glimpse of humanity. It's a glimpse of like what we would do for humanity to save humanity, and like why humanity is beautiful and why it deserves to be saved.
Yeah, like you can take it either way. You can take this, it's all for you as it's all for you, Jin, or it can be it's all for you, humanity. Absolutely.
It was a banger of a needle drop.
So I still felt like it was a very compelling episode considering the fact that it didn't have that huge set piece. It didn't have that big WTF moment. It was so much more focused on these relationships, and I did think that they did that very well.
Agreed.
So what's the experience been like with Julia? This is the first show you're doing together.
It's been
How was
good.
that? What are her thoughts like?
She really likes Three Body Problem. This has been good. She's read the book too. So she's read the
Okay.
first book. So
Okay.
she's about like your level.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, she was very upset about the computer, the human computer, because she said that that was way more in depth in the books and that she
So
was,
much more in depth.
and so she liked that better. She
Yeah.
said that the book was a little bit harder because there's a lot of, since the book was originally written in Chinese, a lot of Chinese names, and so like
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
not used to, Chinese names, so like remembering who was a little bit more difficult.
There literally is in the very beginning of the book. There's a who's who,
Oh wow.
so you can go back and reference
Okay.
who is who. And you can tell it's a translation between that and the fact that there's like all of these footnotes of important things you would most likely knew if you were from this country that are important to what's being said right now. I thought that was kind of interesting. Like it's very clear it's a translation.
So yeah, we've been enjoying it. So unfortunately too, though, like in our schedule we did have to kind of like watch 2 episodes in a day, so there wasn't like a lot of time to sit with an episode and sit with what was going on.
Which two did you have to back?
I think we did 2 back to back. So I think we watched 1 and 2 back to
Mm-hmm.
back. Then I think we watched 3, and then we watched 4 and 5 back to back, and then we watched
Okay.
6.
Okay.
And I think, you know, that's just because how our schedule worked out, and I knew I wanted to get these done before we were recording,
It was not a lot of time to watch all of that. I get that.
and
So that's
so
not optimal.
yeah, so not the most optimal viewing experience, but she's really been enjoying it. We had very similar questions. We were asking the question of like when the Sophons, or when we see like Jack get murdered, like how did Clarence
Hmm.
not see it happen? Like that makes no
Yeah.
sense. Like we get how she can like scrub footage, but how can she not, be seen by the naked eye? And so we had a lot of these questions on why things were the way they were. We didn't know if we were going to get necessarily the right answers or if they were just going to move past it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we've been enjoying it. She's going to watch. This will probably be the first episode she watches, is episode 6 of our podcast. So I think overall it's going to be good. And I do think that
Yeah.
this might pave the way for the next time we do shows that she might watch the show with me. So
Okay.
we'll see.
Okay. Fun.
But I do have one question.
Okay.
Who are they going to put in that rocket pod or the probe? I think it's going to be Raj.
I cannot speak.
Oh, you know who goes in the probe. Okay. All right. We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. No spoilers. We don't want to know yet.
That.
We might get it in the next couple episodes.
So what's interesting about that is, and this to a certain extent goes back to the crappiness of the Netflix model. Okay, so as I'm trying to come up with material to talk about while you're gone, I had some issues with the music. Like I still don't like the opening theme. I think it's garbage. There have been some times with the music that I'm really digging it. There's been other times where it's like the music design isn't blowing me away. And so I wanted to do a little bit of research, and so I read an article that was interviewing the composer, same composer that did Game of Thrones. So they brought the person back, and unfortunately, as it was talking about one of the future, it didn't even say it was talking about one of the future episodes. It just in like one sentence, as it was talking about a decision about sound design, ruin something that's coming up that's
Hmm.
exactly related to the question that you asked. And that's the kind of thing where it's like if we were watching this weekly, press like this could come out. That is still having interesting interviews, asking interesting questions, but we're all on the same page and we can all, versus within a very short period of time of its release, this article has already come out, and like any article that you read, you have to assume that it's could talk about the entirety of the show,
Right.
even if it's less than a week later. So you cannot consume anything. And I do sometimes enjoy reading articles about shows that are coming out
Yeah.
because like maybe there's an interesting interview with like this person or that, like the composer. That'd be interesting to read about that person. It gets you excited. You can't you can't consume anything related to a show on Netflix until you are done.
Yeah.
Because heaven forbid you try and be like excited about it in a way other than binging the show. Like you can't reach to outside stuff to try and talk about theories and what are your thoughts and let me get a little bit more information about what I just saw because anything you consume could contain a spoiler.
Right. Yeah, and I do think that it has, because of that, it's so hard to nail the like WTF moments like at the finale of the seasons. Like it's so hard to hit those like the red wedding of Game of Thrones. Like it
Yeah.
was the end of a season. It's like you're hitting that, but like if everybody could have watched the red, like they release it, people can watch the red wedding in one night after it comes out. It's not going to have the same effect that,
No.
yeah, Netflix do better.
You've you've moved on with your life at that point. And so when somebody else is talking about like how mind-blowing yeah, it did blow your mind at the time, but you've had 2 3 weeks to get over it and move on to something else. And it's like, yeah, that was crazy. Who would talk about the red wedding like that? Who would be like, yeah, that moment was crazy. Like with the level of excitement I just versus like you watch it and then you're talking about to people that just watch it. It's like, I can't believe they did that. That blows my mind.
Yeah, you just can't have moments like that when it's all released at the same time.
So yeah, so unfortunately I had something small ruined. Not the end of the world, but yeah, shame on me for consuming anything related to a show having to do with Netflix before the show is done, because a show about an article about the composer can still give away, big reveals. Like that's such a bummer.
That is a bummer. That is a bummer.
So
Don't read anything.
don't read.
Yeah, readings for squares.
That's I liked how Yi Wenji tried to burn Clarence when she was she said something about like I'm doing a lot of reading. You should try that. And he's like, I read a lot.
I read a lot.
Yeah, so like she tried to get a burn of like you're probably the kind of person who doesn't read. And he's like, no, I read a lot.
And then he burns her
I'm
and
re-
he's like,
Burns her.
I read the transcripts of your lords and Mark Evans, and boy, whew, some steamy stuff in there.
Never mentioned your daughter once.
Not even once.
Like that's how insignificant. That way, yeah, he very casually gets in a good burn right back at her.
I love that it's Wong from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I love that it's Wong. He's the best.
He is. I do think that the book did a slightly better job of portraying him. Like there's certain aspects that you just can't quite see in the show of how off-putting and sometimes kind of inappropriate he can be, but also how just very clever he is, and that being why he's there. I think that Thomas Wade had to actually say it. Of you've lost this job, this job, this job. This is basically your last chance. He gets somebody turns him in for smoking, and Clarence thinks that he's going to be out, and Thomas Wade is like, no, actually that guy's out because
He's
anybody who
worried
cares
about
more
that.
about that than yeah,
Yeah.
they're not worried about what's important. And so I feel like the show had to like really point that out, but like the show I didn't think did a good enough job of showing, especially that it was in the book it's Dashi
Hmm.
versus Clarence. Like Dashi is the person who came up with the plan for the Judgment Day and so casually explains such a horrific plan. Like that is it it shocks the other people in the room.
Well, so, and I think, at least from my like interpretation of watching this, it does feel like more of like Thomas Wade's plan. And I was wondering if it was a little bit like a choice so that Clarence is the more likable character and Thomas Wade is already kind of the asshole character. And so
Mm,
for the audience, like, if you've been following this guy, this detective, and you're kind of rooting for him to solve this mystery, if he's coming up
yeah.
with this horrific plan, you know, how much how much can you relate to him versus like Thomas Wade? We've already seen him be a dick. Like, do we care what he
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
it out of the realm of possibility he'd murder children? Probably not.
Right. And I do get a lot of the choices that they've made. Like it
Mm-hmm.
I they have made some of the things that took so much explanation in the book just instantly visual and had it have a huge impact. But like Julia was saying with like the computer scene, they've also just like brushed past some things where I'd like them to they could still do it in a visual way and have it be interesting. I at times it feels like they don't love the science that got them to this science fiction show where they take the result of that science and they show like the really cool parts and they just brush over how you got to it, which
Yeah.
to me is very interesting.
Yeah, I do wish they did a little bit more into the science.
When I thought that you were going to do the last episode with me, and so I wouldn't have to do the editing, I was actually planning on doing a short, which was going to take a decent amount of editing because I'd have to have like multiple versions of myself using like green screen to do an explanation of the different types of like what is being represented with the computer scene and why there are different types of logic gates and like what they are. And so I was planning on doing this whole thing around literally that scene because I thought it was so much more interesting all the stuff that was left out. So I think it's interesting that that's one of the things you literally said she was bummed wasn't in there because 100% I'm with her on that.
But with that, I believe our journey has come to an end. Thank you folks so much for joining us. It's good to be back with Road Goes Ever On and On. Join us next week as we tackle episodes 7 and 8. That's right, we're doing another 2 episode review, so watch 7 and 8 and come back with us. I'm Mark. This is Sterling.
Thanks.